Usually when we talk about a historical legacy, especially an American founder, there's this expectation of um, absolute purity,
Right.
like a marble statue in a museum. You look at George Washington, the so-called American Cincinnatus, and the image we are fed is just so remarkably clean.
It really is.
We picture this virtuous, reluctant general who vanquishes an empire and then just peacefully surrenders his sword to go back to his farm.
It's a very comforting narrative. I
Wow.
mean, it's the ultimate hero's journey wrapped up in this serene sort of agrarian bow.
Yeah.
And for a long time, that was really the only version of Washington the public wanted.
Right, because we like our founders to be these unbothered demigods. But then you actually step into the historical record of his final years.
Mhm.
We're talking specifically about the period from 1793 to 1799.
Yes.
And when you read the actual documents from that era, that pristine marble statue completely shatters.
It doesn't just shatter, it reveals a twilight period that was, in all reality, brutally difficult.
Yeah.
We are looking at a crucible of bitter political warfare, severe physical decay, and really some profound moral contradictions that haunted him right up to his deathbed.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We've gone through this massive stack of primary sources. We're talking Washington's personal diaries, the Mount Vernon plantation ledgers, venomous opposition newspapers from the 1790s, Martha Washington's surviving correspondence.
Which is fascinating on its own.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, his deeply personal letters to his family. We are using all of this to look past the mythology and unpack the agonizing, deeply human twilight of Washington's life.
Which means we have to cover the absolute disaster that was his second term.
Right.
The private battles he fought at Mount Vernon, his ultimate, highly debated moral reckoning with slavery.
Yeah.
And finally, we're going to take his exact mindset from 1799 and project it into the year 2026 to see how he would view the America we live in today.
I keep thinking of the traditional myth of Washington like an overly filtered social media post.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
You scroll past and see the serene retirement, the perfect sunset over the plantation, the stoic leader. But what is deliberately cropped out of the frame is the absolute chaos, the intense stress, the physical pain, and the vicious partisan warfare happening just inches off camera.
Exactly.
And I guess the obvious question is, how does a guy go from being universally beloved after the revolution to being completely miserable by 1793?
Well, the overarching myth of a unified, nonpartisan republic completely decomposed the moment he took the oath for his second term.
The honeymoon was over.
The honeymoon was definitively over. His cabinet was experiencing a very messy, very public divorce.
Right.
And this was primarily between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson.
But Washington was supposedly above all that, right? I mean,
Well,
he famously hated political parties.
he did hate them, yes. But his belief that he could govern without them was honestly a fatal political delusion. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, was pushing for a powerful central government. To put it simply, Hamilton wanted the federal government to assume all the state debts from the Revolutionary War, create a national bank, and establish a permanent funded debt.
Okay.
He wanted to tie the wealthy elite to the success of the federal government.
So he's essentially building a financial machine to make the federal government the ultimate authority.
Yes.
I can see why Jefferson would hate that.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State, and his ally James Madison were terrified of these mechanisms.
Right.
They were agrarians.
Mhm.
To them, Hamilton's centralized financial system looked exactly like the British corruption they had just fought a war to escape.
Wow.
They believed this consolidation of power, as they called it, was a backdoor to monarchy.
And Washington is just stuck in the middle of this.
He tried to mediate, he really did. But the sources show his inherent conservatism was aligning more and more with Hamilton.
Because he wanted order.
Exactly. Washington wanted federal supremacy and fiscal order. And because he naturally leaned toward Hamilton's policies, Jefferson and Madison began to see Washington not as a neutral patriarch, but as a partisan opponent.
Which leads to something that completely blew my mind in the sources.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. We always complain about the media landscape today, but the partisan playbook was literally invented in Washington's cabinet.
Oh, without a doubt.
And it was vicious.
It was incredibly toxic. The Federalists had John Fenno's Gazette of the United States constantly promoting Hamilton's narrative and praising the administration.
Right.
Jefferson and Madison realized they were losing the public relations war. So they decided they needed their own mouthpiece. They secretly subsidized a new opposition paper called the National Gazette.
And here's the wildest part to me. Jefferson doesn't just encourage this paper.
No.
He personally recruits a poet named Philip Freneau to run it.
Right.
And then Jefferson puts Freneau on the State Department payroll as a translating clerk.
It's unbelievable.
He is literally using government money to fund a partisan operative whose entire job is to savage the very administration Jefferson is working for. How did Washington react to that level of duplicity?
He was infuriated, but
Yeah.
also, deeply confused. You have to understand Washington's psychology here.
Okay.
His entire public persona was built on disinterested virtue. He truly believed his actions were inherently patriotic and objective.
Right. He thought he was above the fray.
Exactly. Therefore, he was utterly incapable of interpreting opposition as just a difference of political opinion. To him, criticizing the government meant you were trying to destroy the republic.
So when Freneau starts writing these relentless attacks, calling Washington's behavior monarchical, it must have felt like a profound personal betrayal.
Absolutely. Freneau specifically targeted Washington's formal European-style levees.
These were the receptions, right?
Yeah, these were stiff, formal receptions the president held where visitors would essentially bow to him.
Wow.
Freneau argued the administration was galloping fast into monarchy. Jefferson privately agreed, by the way.
Of course he did.
But Washington genuinely didn't see himself as a king. He thought these levees were just necessary to establish respect for the office of the presidency on the world stage.
But Freneau's criticism looks incredibly polite compared to what comes next.
Oh, yes.
Enter Benjamin Franklin Bash.
Yes, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin himself.
They called him Lightning Rod Jr.
Right.
He edits a paper called the Aurora General Advertiser, and he just strips away any remaining reverence for George Washington. The Aurora accused Washington of overdrawing his presidential salary, acting like a common defaulter, and even printed pieces suggesting Washington was debauching the nation.
The rhetoric was astonishing. One writer in the Aurora warned the American people that they were blindly accepting royalist, tyrannical actions simply because the president was the man of their affections. They were systematically tearing down the idol they had built.
And it wasn't just young journalists throwing stones. It was his fellow revolutionary heroes, too. I read Thomas Paine's 1796 open letter to Washington, and my jaw dropped. Thomas Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense.
Paine's letter is one of the most brutal takedowns in American political history.
Yeah.
Paine had been imprisoned in France during the Reign of Terror, and he felt Washington had completely abandoned him there.
Right. So he writes this devastating public letter calling Washington treacherous and a hypocrite. He actually writes that the world will be puzzled whether Washington is an apostate or an imposter.
What's fascinating here is that this wasn't just political noise for Washington. It deeply, deeply wounded him.
It got under his skin.
It really did. It
Yeah.
pushed him further into the Federalist faction and cemented a genuine paranoia that there was a vast, coordinated conspiracy to tear down the government.
Wait, I want to push back on that a bit. Was it entirely paranoia? Or was he right to be terrified? Because if you look at the real-world crises of his second term, the country was genuinely on the brink of tearing itself apart.
That's a fair point. His psychological stress was absolutely compounded by real events that forced his hand. The opposition press was fanning the flames of actual uprisings. Let's look at the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794.
Right. So Hamilton gets his way and passes an excise tax on distilled spirits to help pay off that national debt.
Yeah.
But for the frontier farmers in western Pennsylvania, whiskey isn't just a drink, it's practically their currency.
Yeah.
They use it to trade because hard cash is scarce.
Exactly. And transporting raw grain over the mountains was nearly impossible, so they distilled it into whiskey to move it.
Makes sense.
To them, this tax was an existential threat to their livelihood, and it felt suspiciously like the British taxes they had just fought against. So they rebelled.
Yeah.
They attacked tax collectors, burned property, armed themselves. It was the first direct, armed challenge to federal authority under the new Constitution.
And Washington's response is wild by modern standards. He doesn't just issue a statement from his desk. He physically mounts his horse and personally leads a militia force of 13,000 men into western Pennsylvania. 13,000 troops.
It's incredible.
That's roughly the size of the entire Continental Army he commanded during the Revolution, used to put down a domestic tax revolt.
The sheer show of force worked. The rebellion collapsed before any major battles occurred. But the political fallout was immense.
Oh, I'm sure.
It completely alienated Westerners and gave the Jeffersonians massive amounts of ammunition. To Jefferson and his allies, Washington had just proved their worst fears. The federal government was eager to use a standing army against its own citizens to enforce Hamilton's heavy-handed financial policies.
But the Whiskey Rebellion looks like a minor disagreement compared to what happens next, the Jay Treaty in 1795.
Yes.
I feel like this is a moment where the country almost fundamentally broke.
It was arguably the greatest crisis of his presidency. The context here is crucial. Great Britain and revolutionary France were at war. The U.S. was trying to remain neutral, but Britain was seizing American ships in the Caribbean and impressing our sailors. We were on the absolute brink of a catastrophic war with Britain that the United States simply could not afford.
So Washington sends Chief Justice John Jay to London to figure it out.
Yes, and Jay returns with a treaty that prevents war, gets the British to finally abandon their forts in the American Northwest, and open some trade. But in exchange, the U.S. had to concede to British maritime dominance and limit trade with France.
And when the Jeffersonians hear about this, they lose their minds.
Completely.
They view this as a profound, unforgivable betrayal of France, our revolutionary ally, just to appease the British monarchy.
The administration tried to keep the term secret while the Senate debated it, but a Virginia senator, Stevens Thompson Mason, leaked an advance copy to our old friend Benjamin Franklin Bash.
Who promptly printed it in the Aurora.
Exactly.
And the country erupts. The sources describe mobs gathering in cities from Philadelphia to Boston. They are burning John Jay in effigy. They are throwing rocks at Alexander Hamilton's head when he tries to defend the treaty in public. And for the first time, the mob turns its fury directly on Washington.
It was unprecedented.
They are gathering outside the presidential mansion, cursing his name, demanding war with England. Bash's paper literally declared, "The fountains of the great deep are broken up."
That moment marked the total undeniable collapse of Washington's nonpartisan ideal. He forced the treaty through because he knew war with Britain would destroy the country. But the cost was his universal popularity.
Yeah.
And what we have to understand is that alongside this severe political deterioration, his physical health was entering a steep, terrifying decline.
We really need to talk about the physical reality of being George Washington in the 1790s. Because the story everyone learns in school is that he had wooden teeth.
Right.
And that myth hides the truth that is so dark and so physically agonizing, it completely changes how you view him.
The wooden teeth myth is entirely false. His dental issues were chronic and agonizing. By the time he was inaugurated, he only had one natural tooth left. His dentures were these excruciating complex devices made of lead base, steel springs holding the upper and lower plates together, animal teeth, and human teeth.
And the source material on where he got those human teeth is just chilling.
It is. The Mount Vernon ledgers show that Washington purchased those human teeth from the very people he enslaved.
Let's just pause on that. He literally bought the teeth out of the mouths of the people he kept in bondage to have them wired into his own jaw.
Yes.
It is this visceral, almost grotesque physical connection to the institution of slavery. And beyond moral horror of it, the physical mechanics of these dentures caused him constant, unrelenting agony. They disfigured his jaw, pushed his lips out abnormally, and the steel springs were so strong he had to actively strain his facial muscles just to keep his mouth closed.
That physical reality contributed heavily to what his contemporaries saw as his famous stoicism.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he rarely smiled and spoke very little in his later years. But as the sources reveal, it wasn't just philosophical stoicism. It was a mask for a simmering, underlying anger.
Wow.
He was in constant pain, his reputation was being dragged through the mud, and psychologically he was consumed by bitterness toward a public he felt was profoundly ungrateful.
And his political enemies totally weaponized his fatigue, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Washington would occasionally mention how tired he was in letters to Jefferson or Madison, but instead of offering sympathy, they used it against him. They started leaking rumors to their newspaper allies suggesting the president was becoming senile, that his mind was going, and that he was just a confused old man being manipulated by Alexander Hamilton's wicked schemes.
Which only deepened his obsession with his own infallibility. Because Washington couldn't admit to any political missteps regarding the Jay Treaty or the Whiskey Rebellion, he assumed any criticism of him was a malicious plot to destroy the Republic itself.
So he just doubles down.
He does. He dismissed Jefferson entirely, viewing him as a prodigal son who had lost his way.
You would think that when he finally retires in 1797, goes back to Mount Vernon, the paranoia would fade.
You would think so.
Yeah, he's out of the game, right? But the paranoia actually metastasizes. It turns into support for some incredibly authoritarian policies under his successor, John Adams.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a chapter of Washington's life that rarely gets discussed. We were talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798.
Right.
John Adams is president, Congress is controlled by Federalists, and the U.S. is engaged in the quasi-war with France.
This was an undeclared naval war.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, where French privateers are seizing American ships. The fear of French spies and radical Jacobin ideology infiltrating America was at a fever pitch.
So Congress passes these 4 laws, and they are draconian. Let me just quickly outline how insane these were. First, the Naturalization Act, which stretches the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years.
Yes.
That was specifically designed to suppress immigrant voting power because most new immigrants voted for the Jeffersonians.
Correct. It was purely partisan gerrymandering via immigration law.
Then you have the Alien Friends and Alien Enemies Acts, which give the president sweeping, almost dictatorial powers to deport any non-citizen he deemed dangerous without trial.
Without any due process.
But the absolute worst one is the Sedition Act. It makes it a federal crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, the Congress, or the president.
They essentially criminalize political dissent. It represents the exact opposite of the Republican liberty that Washington had supposedly fought a revolution to secure.
But wait, Washington is retired in Virginia when this happens? Adams signed it. Why are we blaming Washington for this?
Because behind the scenes, Washington's quiet support for these laws was absolute. The sources are clear.
Oh,
Okay.
no.
In a 1798 letter to his former Secretary of War, James McHenry, Washington explicitly defends suppressing the press. He celebrates the fact that the Sedition Act has silenced the brawlers against government measures.
Wow.
He writes to Alexander Spotswood defending the laws as necessary bulwarks against those seeking to divide and destroy the nation.
And who gets caught in the Sedition Act net? Our old friend, Benjamin Franklin Bash.
Yes.
He's arrested under the Sedition Act, and tragically, before he can stand trial, he dies of yellow fever in Philadelphia. Dozens of Democratic-Republican newspaper editors are thrown in federal prisons simply for criticizing John Adams.
And Washington wasn't just a passive observer cheering this on. Later in 1798, Adams appoints Washington as commander-in-chief of the Provisional Army, which was being raised in case France actually invaded.
Right, and Washington accepts, but only on the condition that he gets to handpick his general staff.
Yes.
And what does he do with that power? He institutes a blatant political loyalty test. He systematically purges anyone with Democratic-Republican sympathies from the officer corps. He only allows loyal Federalists to hold rank.
His trauma from the press attacks in his second term completely blinded him to the tyrannical nature of what the Federalists were doing. In his mind, the survival of the Republic required the absolute suppression of its loudest critics.
It's why.
He had retreated to Mount Vernon, hoping for tranquility, claiming he just wanted to sit under his own vine and fig tree. But the reality of his retirement was anything but a peaceful retreat.
Let's talk about life at Mount Vernon, because reading the diaries, it sounds absolutely exhausting.
Oh, it was a nightmare.
He described his own home as a well-resorted tavern. Because he is essentially the most famous man in the Western world, there is a relentless, never-ending influx of visitors. You have politicians, foreign dignitaries, artists, and complete strangers who just show up hoping to stare at him while he eats dinner.
The ledgers show that overnight guests were present roughly 2/3 of the time during his retirement.
2/3.
Yes. And this forces us to shift our focus to Martha Washington. Because while George could escape the house to ride his lands and survey his farms for hours a day, the crushing burden of this hospitality fell entirely on Martha.
It's like she was forced to run a massive high-end hotel with 0 days off.
Exactly. She was managing a massive domestic infrastructure. The larder, the scullery, the kitchens, the scheduling, and coordinating the enslaved workforce required to maintain this illusion of effortless Virginian gentility for all these uninvited guests.
And she hated it.
She did.
She privately wrote that she felt like a state prisoner. The lack of privacy was so extreme that one historian noted they apparently only had dinner alone together twice in their last 20 years of marriage. Twice.
It's a staggering detail that highlights the intense constraints placed upon women in his orbit. And this actually brings us to a fascinating window into Washington's views on gender, autonomy, and what we might call his belief in a strict domestic destiny for women.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at Eleanor Nellie Parke Custis.
Yes, Nellie.
She is Washington's step-granddaughter, and by all accounts, she is brilliant. Spirited, highly educated, fiercely observant, people constantly noted her incredible firmness of mind.
Hmm.
And she actually writes to Washington and suggests that she might prefer to remain a spinster to avoid the irrationalities of romance. She essentially says, I see how this works, and I think I'd prefer my independence.
And Washington's response, found in his letters to her from 1795 and 1796, is incredibly revealing about how his mind worked.
Yeah.
He systematically and coldly deconstructs the idea of romantic love. He calls it too dainty a food to live upon alone.
Ugh.
He warns her not to look for perfect felicity in marriage, and he cautions that the passions of her sex were easier aroused than allayed.
It's so transactional. He basically tells her to subject any potential suitor to a cold, rational interrogation. Is he a man of sense? Is he a gambler? Does he have enough money to maintain the luxurious lifestyle you're accustomed to?
Very practical, but very cold.
He even warns her against being a thorough-paced coquette. He basically says that if women reject suitors just to assert their own power or independence, they will face celibacy as a punishment.
On the surface, you could read it as pragmatic, grandfatherly advice for the 18th century. But deeply analyzed, it exposes a man who was fundamentally committed to maintaining strict social hierarchies.
Right.
In Washington's worldview, women were not autonomous actors meant to participate in the civic life or intellectual life of the nation he built. Their destiny was strictly domestic, to secure a wealthy, sensible husband and manage a household.
And the tragic part is he successfully engineered her life to perfectly fit that vision. Nellie ended up marrying Washington's own nephew, Lawrence Lewis, on Washington's final birthday in 1799.
Yep.
She subordinated her intellect and her spark to plantation management exactly as the patriarch prescribed.
The control he exerted over his family was absolute. And this intense need for domestic control, this rigid adherence to hierarchy, leads us directly into the darkest and most profoundly contradictory aspect of Washington's twilight.
Yeah.
His role as an enslaver of over 300 human beings in Mount Vernon.
Right. If we are going to look past the marble statue, we have to completely dismantle the historical narrative that Washington was this benevolent, evolving patriarch who was gentle on the issue of slavery.
We do.
Because the sources show a man who was deeply vindictive, calculating, and ruthless when his own human property was at stake. We need to talk about Ona Judge.
Ona Judge is a crucial figure in understanding Washington. She was a highly skilled 23-year-old enslaved woman, essentially Martha Washington's personal attendant.
Okay.
In 1796, the Washingtons are living in Philadelphia, which was then the capital. Ona discovers that Martha is planning to give her away as a wedding gift to Martha's granddaughter, who had a reputation for a volatile temper.
And Ona knows that returning to Virginia and being given to this granddaughter means permanent, inescapable enslavement.
So while the Washingtons are eating their dinner, she just walks out the door. She secures secret passage on a ship heading up to New Hampshire.
And Washington's reaction is furious. He places an ad in the Philadelphia papers offering a $10 bounty for her capture. I looked it up. $10 back then was roughly the cost of a barrel of flour.
The President of the United States equated the life, liberty, and bodily autonomy of a 23-year-old woman to a barrel of flour.
But the lengths he goes to retrieve her are what really show his character here. He doesn't just hire a local bounty hunter. He uses the power of the federal government.
Yes.
He uses his Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott Jr., and a customs collector named Joseph Whipple to try and seize her in New Hampshire. And he explicitly writes to them, telling them to bypass the local courts if they have to.
It's amazing.
He is asking federal agents to directly and illegally violate the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, a law that Washington himself signed into law.
Because to Washington, the law mattered for the Republic, but his property rights superseded it.
Unbelievable.
He complained endlessly in his letters about Ona's ingratitude, claiming she had been treated like a child rather than a servant. At one point, Ona Judge actually offered a compromise.
Right. She reached out.
She sent word that she would voluntarily return to the Washingtons and serve them for the rest of their lives if they would legally promise to free her upon their deaths. Washington flatly refused to negotiate with his own property.
He was still trying to capture her in 1799, mere months before his own death. He sent a relative up to New Hampshire to try and take her by force, but thankfully the plot failed and she lived out her life in freedom.
Thank goodness.
But Ona wasn't the only one. Hercules, the famous head cook in the presidential household, also escaped in 1797.
And a context of why they were able to escape in Philadelphia brings up another chilling example of Washington's administrative calculation.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania had passed the 1780 Gradual Abolition Act. It stated that any enslaved person residing in the state for 6 continuous months had to be legally freed.
It's like a modern billionaire exploiting a technical offshore tax loophole. But instead of hiding money, Washington is hiding human beings from their own legal freedom.
There's a very accurate analogy. Washington demonstrated a cold administrative precision here. To avoid the 6-month legal threshold, he relentlessly rotated his enslaved workers, like Ona Judge and Hercules, in and out of Pennsylvania every 5.5 months.
Wow.
He would send them back to Mount Vernon or across the border to New Jersey for a few days, just to reset the residency clock, specifically to deny them the liberty that Pennsylvania law granted them.
It is a systemic, highly calculated evasion of the law to maintain human bondage, which is what makes the climax of his moral life so incredibly debated and complex.
It does.
Because we reach July 1799. He sits down, drafts his final will and testament entirely on his own, and he mandates the emancipation of the 123 enslaved individuals he legally owns.
He stipulates they are to be freed upon Martha's death. His reasoning in the will is that immediate emancipation would cause painful separations from the custis dower slaves. Right.
These were the enslaved people owned by Martha's first husband's estate, whom Washington had no legal right to free. He also provided a trust fund for the young and elderly enslaved people he freed to be supported and taught to read and write.
Now, on one hand, this is undeniably a monumental action. He is the only slaveholding founding father to free his slaves. Jefferson didn't do it. Madison didn't do it. But
this raises an important question. What was the true motive behind this act? Historians debate this fiercely, and the sources allow for multiple interpretations.
Okay.
Was it a genuine moment of moral redemption? The final culmination of his internal wrestling with Enlightenment ideals of liberty?
Or was it a final, spiteful strike against the Jeffersonian Southerners who tormented his second term? By doing this, he permanently separates himself morally from the Southern planter class that had caused him so much grief.
He also cannot ignore his lifelong obsession with his own historical infallibility. In his final days, he clearly realized that the institution of human bondage and a republic built on liberty could not permanently coexist.
Was this will a calculated mechanism to protect his historical legacy from the permanent stain of hypocrisy?
Whatever his internal motive was, the immediate real-world aftermath was deeply tragic. Think about Martha Washington's reality after he dies.
Oh, it was awful for everyone involved.
She is an aging woman trapped on a relatively isolated estate, completely surrounded by over 100 enslaved people who know that their freedom depends entirely on her taking her last breath.
Abigail Adams visited Mount Vernon in 1800 and wrote in her letters that Martha lived in absolute terror, feeling that her life wasn't safe, constantly looking over her shoulder.
Paralyzed by that fear of being murdered in her sleep, Martha decided she couldn't wait. She freed Georgia's slaves early, on January 1st, 1801.
Right.
But because the Custis Dower slaves remained in bondage, just as Washington feared, families across Mount Vernon were permanently separated anyway. Husbands were freed while their wives and children remained enslaved. It's a devastating, messy consequence of a delayed moral decision.
And that brings us to the very end. December 1799. Washington comes in from riding his plantation in the freezing rain and falls violently ill with epiglottitis, a severe throat infection.
Yeah.
The medical practices of the day only hasten his death. His doctors subject him to massive bloodlettings, draining nearly half his blood volume in a matter of hours.
Horrifying.
On December 14th, struggling for air, he feels his own pulse, whispers 'tis well, and passes away.
So his life ends, but his ideas obviously endure. We wanted to end this deep dive with a thought experiment. We take his dying anxieties, specifically outlined in his famous 1796 farewell address, where he urgently warned against extreme partisanship, regionalism, and foreign entanglements, and we project that exact mindset into the year 2026.
It's a fascinating exercise.
And before we do this, I want to be extremely clear to our listeners. We are not using Washington to score points on modern politics. We are strictly taking his 1799 worldview, drawn directly from his letters and farewell address, and asking how that specific 18th century conservative, hierarchy-obsessed mind would process our reality today.
Looking at 2026 through Washington's eyes requires balancing what he would see as profound triumphs with what he would consider tragic, unrecognizable mutations of his republic.
Right.
Let's start with the triumphs.
Yeah.
He would be absolutely awed by the sheer endurance of the United States.
Oh, absolutely. The fact that this fragile experiment now spans an entire continent, possesses an unimaginably dynamic economy, and has maintained an uninterrupted constitutional government for over 2 centuries, that surpasses his wildest dreams.
It really does.
The federal authority he rode out to defend during the Whiskey Rebellion is now the absolute, unquestioned bedrock of the modern state. He would view the survival of the Union as his ultimate victory.
But then he would look at the structural mechanisms of our modern society, and his anxiety would likely overwhelm his pride.
So what does this all mean? Applying his farewell address warnings to today, what breaks his heart?
He explicitly warned that the baneful effects of the spirit of party would lead to the ruins of public liberty. Looking at our bitter, institutionalized two-party gridlock, our performative media outrage, a populace divided into deeply hostile camps, he would see his absolute darkest fears manifested.
I can only imagine him looking at the modern digital media landscape.
Oh boy.
If he thought Benjamin Franklin Bash and Philip Freneau were bad in print, he would look at the instantaneous reach, the algorithm-driven partisan vitriol, and the 247 news cycle today, and he would see a million Freneaus on steroids.
Exactly.
It would confirm every paranoid instinct he had in 1798.
Furthermore, his mandate against permanent foreign entanglements was absolute. He believed America needed to stay completely out of European affairs to survive.
Yeah.
The sprawling network of global military alliances today, treaties like NATO, the UN, deep military integration into international conflicts, this would horrify him. He would also view the vast, modern executive state with its massive bureaucracy and standing global armies as uncomfortably close to the European monarchies he fought to expel.
But honestly, I think the most profound cognitive dissonance for him wouldn't be foreign policy. It would be the evolution of American civil rights.
Oh, without question.
As we discussed, he meticulously tried to control a rigidly hierarchical, patriarchal, and white-dominated society. He firmly believed in aristocratic suppression, which is why he supported the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Consequently, a multiracial democracy where women possess total legal autonomy, where they serve in the military and run for president, and where the descendants of the very people he enslaved hold full political franchise, that would shock him to his core.
His 18th century mind would just break. He would struggle to comprehend that America's modern strength and endurance come not from the top-down suppression and elite control he tried to enforce, but from the chaotic, messy, expansive inclusion of all citizens.
He would have to reckon with the fact that his original, highly restricted design was ultimately insufficient for the nation's survival.
It really completely dismantles the myth of the stoic, unbothered demigod in the marble statue.
It does.
Today, we've seen a man who was fiercely ambitious, physically and mentally battered by a brutal second term, reliant on a strict patriarchal worldview, and profoundly conflicted over his legacy and the institution of slavery. He wasn't a pristine deity. He was a deeply flawed titan who was almost crushed by the weight of the nation he helped create.
Yet, despite all of those flaws and his desire for control, in his final act with his will, he demonstrated a capacity for moral evolution that his contemporaries completely evaded. It was messy, it was delayed, and it had tragic consequences, but he ultimately realized the central contradiction of his life.
Which leaves us with this final thought to mull over, one that I think reshapes how we view the entire founding generation. Washington's greatest achievement might not be the rigid constitutional design he desperately tried to control until his dying breath,
Right.
but rather that he inadvertently built a system capable of outgrowing his own profound moral limitations. It begs the question for all of us. Is the true mark of a successful society that it eventually becomes unrecognizable to its founders?
That's a great question.
Next time you look at a marble statue or a perfectly filtered image of history, just remember the messy, agonizing human truth waiting right outside the frame.